It's not just like the FBI did an incompetent job, which would be bad enough when you're talking about a bio-warfare attack on Congress. You'd want to get it right. But they actually misled not just the public, they misled the Congress.
You're listening to the Corbett Report.
Welcome, friends. This is James Corbett of CorbettReport.com, coming to you in a conversation that is being recorded on the 1st of December 2020. And this morning I am joined on the line by Mick Harrison and David Meiswinkle with the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry, which is an organization that my long-term and well-informed listeners will be familiar with from my previous conversation, interview 1383 for those keeping track at home, talking to the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry about the 9/11 grand jury. But today we're going to be talking about a slightly different topic, the recently launched Lawyers Committee Anthrax Petition, a petition to Congress for a redress of grievances that we're going to be talking about in some degree of detail. So let's invite them on and let's introduce them. First of all, David, thank you for joining us today.
James, thank you for having us.
And Mick, thank you for joining us as well.
Thank you, James. Good to be here.
All right, could you two just take a brief moment to introduce yourselves and your relation to the Lawyers Committee?
Well, I'm the President and Executive Director of the Lawyers Committee. I'm a United States Army veteran. I'm a former police officer and a whistleblower, and a criminal defense attorney. And probably about 4 years ago or so, and Mick can correct me, we got together a number of very conscientious and concerned citizens around the 9/11 issue. And as you know, our first effort was to try and get a grand jury petition and set it up and get some kind of a movement in New York City. And we are well on the way to doing that. And we have concluded through that investigation that the controlled demolition, bombs and explosives were involved in bringing those towers down. Now, our second big effort, although we've done other efforts in between, is the anthrax investigation. We've submitted now to Congress a 76-page document with 69 exhibits, some of the exhibits never seen before by the public, and a 3-page letter you've probably received, an executive summary of the what we found. So basically, we're excited that we're going to try to move with Congress. We're also working on a grand jury petition that will be submitted to the U.S. Attorney probably within a month to a month and a half, that will cover these anthrax crimes, but actually even in a more comprehensive manner than we've done thus far.
Excellent. And Mick, can you tell us about your position with the Lawyers Committee?
Sure. I'm the litigation director, James, and I handle the civil federal lawsuits. We have 5 active at the moment. 3 are Freedom of Information Act lawsuits, trying to get government documents related to 9/11. And if you want to know more about those, we can chat about those at some point. We also have a lawsuit related to the grand jury case you mentioned that we'll talk about later. We did submit, as David mentioned, a petition to the U.S. Attorney in New York regarding the demolition evidence. And because it appears that petition did not get submitted to the federal grand jury as required by law, we are suing the U.S. Attorney in federal court to force that to happen. And then our other federal lawsuit, the 5th one, is regarding the FBI 9/11 Review Commission, not to be confused with the original 9/11 Commission. This was 2014-2015. Ed Meese was in charge of a new panel that was mandated by Congress to look at all the new evidence and actually a lot of the old evidence regarding 9/11. But they actually didn't do that. They pretended to do it, but didn't actually do it. So we're suing to try to force that to happen in reality. And just a little background on me. I'm a whistleblower attorney of, 30 years now. Experience, I represent government and corporate whistleblowers. I also represent environmental groups, nonprofits, and government oversight issues and law enforcement issues for citizens. I'll stop there. I could go on.
I think that will suffice for now, but as you say, we will be circling back around to the 9/11 work that obviously is one of the core mission programs of the 9/11 inquiry. But let's Let's get into today's conversation talking specifically about the anthrax petition. And before I think we even get into the technical details of what this petition is and what it's attempting to do, I think we have to set the groundwork for this conversation. It should be fairly apparent to my regular listeners the importance of the 2001 anthrax attacks during this time that we are living through right now. So much of what we are living through right now has been prepared legislatively and in terms of other organizations and groups within the government that have actually been created as a result of what happened in late 2001 in the anthrax attacks. But can I get in your own words what you feel the importance of raising this issue once again is?
Right. Well, as you mentioned, the context is very important. And as if we think back to 2001, the first anthrax attack letters were sent out a week after 9/11. And the suspects at that time that the media had been hyping and for quite a while was Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Interestingly enough, however, in December, it was found that the anthrax letters didn't contain the bentonite, which would be associated with Iraq. During that period of time, however, during the scare or the panic, the U.S. Patriot Act was basically pushed through and approved in late October, right after two senators received the attack letters. That's Senator Daschle and Senator Leahy. Now, during that period of time, there were two launchings, this way I'd characterize them, one around September 18th and another one around October 9th. And then eventually October 15th, Daschle got his letter. November 16th, Leahy's letter was found in the mail. But during that time, a man named Robert Stevens, who worked for American media down in Boca Raton, Florida, died from anthrax, and he was the first known person to have died. In total, 5 people died. 17 were poisoned by it, so a total of 22. And then investigations began. They lasted for 9 years at least, and they went through a number of possibilities. Now, what's interesting of this is a bioweapon, and the type of anthrax here, it's a lot of controversy over, and depending on who you talk about, is what was the nature of this. There's 2 launchings. The first to the New York Post and Tom Brokaw, CBS, that was a granular brown stuff that was, of course, strong enough to kill you if you inhaled it. But the second to the U.S. senators was much more refined and pure. It had never been seen before. On one spore was 1 trillion. If you think of that, James, 1 trillion spores on 1 gram of this stuff. So this was, like, again, as I said, it was never seen before. But there was a lot of controversy between people who said it wasn't a weaponized version, and there was it found inside these spores were different chemicals, which we can talk about. Things that Mick will probably get into it too, for these morphites, which were found, 4 morphs, and there's other things like tin and silicone and iron and oxygen. And where you start to look at where they supposedly are, you can find out that the proper investigation really wasn't done. So where we are now, and you said right now we're in the midst of a pandemic, or so to speak, a worldwide pandemic, where we have this material that's come out of wherever it's come out of, whether it's Wuhan or whether it's somewhere else. But the question there is whether and what is this? And the esteemed attorney, Francis Boyle, who actually drafted the Bioweapons Treaty, he believes that there's a bioweapon involved here. We haven't taken a position, or the Lawyers Committee hasn't taken a position on whether it's a bioweapon or not. But if the original attack back in 2001 had properly been investigated, perhaps many things, including what we're experiencing today, would not have happened or be happening.
Such an important issue, and I want to direct people at this point to the resources that I'll be providing in the show notes, links not only to the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry at lc4911.org, that's LCFOR911.org, but also to the anthrax petition. First of all, the executive summary, the 3-page summary that does a good job of simply summarizing the main points of this investigation, but perhaps more importantly to the 76-page petition itself and the exhibits index, which contains more information about this and more gritty details than we can possibly get into in a conversation like this. So that will all be linked up in the show notes, and I invite people to explore that and really get into this. But let's see if we can summarize some of the main evidence, because I understand you have compiled a team of researchers to help you in your investigation for this petition and have uncovered even new documents that have not been seen by the public before. Let's talk about some of the evidence that you have uncovered.
Right.
So Dave, before you do that, can I just add a couple points to James's earlier question? Because the big picture question about why is this still important, is maybe lost on some people. This did happen in 2001. So, people should keep in mind, maybe I'm stating the obvious, that the anthrax attacks were phase 2 of the 9/11 attacks. So they came on the heels of the attacks that brought down the Twin Towers. As Dave mentioned, we have this petition with the demolition evidence indicating that there's much more to the destruction of the towers than people have been told. So we don't have at the moment reason to believe that the phase 2 of the attacks, the anthrax attacks, were perpetrated by people other than those who perpetrated phase 1 of the attacks, the folks who brought down the towers. And, phase 2 was used just as phase 1 to exacerbate fear, to force folks to change their normal, let's say, pacifism to be ready for the U.S. to go to war in Afghanistan, Iraq. And now we have the endless war on terror that resulted. So keep in mind, it wasn't just the terror attacks of 9/11, but the follow-on anthrax attacks that really generated so much fear and anxiety that people were ready to support these wars that have continued. So I just want to add that big picture context, and then Dave, go ahead with your talk about the evidence, and maybe describe our investigative committee a little bit.
Right, certainly. James, we have an interesting committee. We have on there a number of attorneys like John O'Kelly, who's on our board, and Jane Clark. John O'Kelly's from New York and Jane's from Texas. And we have researchers like Barbara Honecker on there. And we have a key researcher, investigator, Christine Borgeson, is part of our committee. Graham McQueen is a doctor of religion in Canada and who's written extensively in 9/11 issues. He's also written a book on anthrax as a domestic conspiracy. And Merle Nass, who is actually a doctor, and she's worked with anthrax in Rhodesia. And so she's really an expert on it. So we've had before our committee people like Rich Lambert. He came before head of the FBI, head of the, at least he was head of the anthrax investigation for 4 years. He was an inspector. He was in charge. He was a whistleblower. He left. When he left, he was totally disconcerted by what he experienced with the FBI. And he wrote a 2,000-page summary, 16 pages exculpating Bruce Ivins. He told us if we can get it, we have to go to Congress to get it. That's how sensitive this is. Now, it was people had tried to get it through Freedom of Information Act, and still, at least they found it existed in Quantico, but they didn't get it yet. We're going to try and make an effort to get that. Now, what we found is this, is that a number of suspects have been arraigned over the years. And it started with people in Pennsylvania, two fellows, I think they worked in Levittown, or they worked somewhere outside of Philadelphia, and they had nothing to do with it, but they were, I think, of Palestinian background, and they lost their job because of the investigation. Then there was a doctor in New York who had nothing to do with it, but he became suspicious for some reason or another, and he was eventually exonerated, but he lost his marriage. Then there was a guy named Perry Marxell, who actually worked at USEMRID, which is the United States Army Medical Research Institute for Infectious Diseases, and that's where Fort Detrick. And they squeezed him so much that he started drinking again, which he shouldn't do because he had a bad liver. And then he ends up dying. Then they spend from 2002 to 2007 on Stephen Hatfield. And Hatfield was, their prime suspect for a long time. And then he turned the tables on them and he sued them because of violation of his privacy rights. And he won $5.8 million. Then at that time, they had Bruce Ivins lined up. Now, Bruce had some mental health issues earlier on, but they squeezed him. They embarrassed him. They harassed him. They harassed his family. And eventually, he supposedly, allegedly commits suicide. Now, we've had two people tell us they think he was murdered. We don't know that. but he was dead, even though he was on 24/7 watch, and he started drinking too. So that's characteristic of when they start putting pressure on you, start watching you, start monitoring everything you do in your life for 24/7, puts a lot of pressure and people start drinking. What we found out based on our research, based on talking to witnesses, was that he could not have done this. He didn't have the acumen. He hadn't have the background, although he was an expert in anthrax. The difference here is that at Fort Detrick, the anthrax was liquid. And what we're dealing with is a sophisticated powder that takes sophisticated equipment to develop. And it's more or less along the lines of a bioweapon. Now, what's really interesting is earlier on, and for whatever reason, the FBI brings Battelle in to analyze this stuff, okay? That just got, I think, from the Daxel letter. And the Army was going, wow, this stuff is the strongest stuff we've ever seen. Back in the 60s, this is 10 times stronger than anything when Nixon shut the program down in 1969. Battelle gets a hold of it. Thomas Kuthau, I think is his name, or something like that. And he comes back and says, this stuff's nothing. He says it's like 10 to 50 times less powerful than what the Army's saying. To which the Army colonel responds, he goes crazy, he goes bonkers. And he says, you guys autoclave this stuff. You turn it into hockey pucks. In other words, you destroy the evidence that you're analyzing, all right? And basically trying to destroy the investigation. So that's at the beginning of this. This stuff is so energetic that the Daxel letters, it's climbing up the test tubes. When they try to put it under a microscope, it's moving off the plate of the microscope. So what we're doing with the summary, and I know I'm maybe going on a little bit too long here on this, because we could talk for, like you said, for hours on this subject matter. But what our investigation showed is that Ivins couldn't have done it. There wouldn't have been evidence to prove him guilty whatsoever. And we go into the science, which we will, and Mick will pick up on that. We'll see that their strongest suit, the science, is as weak as anything. It's not a strong suit. And we find out, too, that the FBI, we believe they obstructed and corrupted the investigation. We believe that this investigation needs to be taken up to Congress. And we need, in fact, there was a bill at one time, H.R. 720. We've talked to Rush Holt about it. He's retired now. Congressman Nadler's still around. Senator Leahy's still around. Senator Grassley's still around. They all want another investigation. New York Times wanted an investigation. The Washington Post wanted an investigation. We've talked to a number of scientists that believes that this should be investigated. So let's investigate it. But the FBI can't investigate itself. The Justice Department can't investigate itself. So we'll be asking for a special investigator, special counsel to get involved.
Mick, I'll turn it over to you to anything to add about that evidence. But before we do so, I should just vouch for the investigation committee that you've put together and say that I myself have interviewed both Dr. Gray McQueen and Dr. Merrill Nass about their respective anthrax research. So I'll put the links into in the show notes into those conversations so people can hear more of their own research and investigation into this. But Mick, how about anything to add regarding the evidence that you've uncovered?
Sure. Well, there are details, of course, in the petition, but some big picture points that are worth noting. One is that the case against Bruce Ivins, Dr. Bruce Ivins, by the FBI appeared strong for those who just took what the FBI said at face value. But when you really looked at the details, which we did, not only was there nothing there against Ivins, there was really some pretty strong evidence, as Dave said, the FBI had intentionally misled, not just the public, but Congress as well. Now, what are the key points in that? Well, one is the FBI took the position that Ivins appeared guilty because what they called the murder weapon, which was a certain flask of anthrax at the Maryland facility, the Army facility at Fort Detrick, they called it 1029, RMR 1029. The FBI said that was the murder weapon. And they said that because they did genetic analysis, DNA analysis, which they said, and they did this based on 1,000 samples that they collected from labs around the country and some outside the country of folks who had used anthrax, and they were trying to track where the anthrax came from that was used in the attacks. So they did the DNA analysis, and they came up with what they called a fingerprint, which was these morphs that Dave mentioned, some mutations that were unusual that they found in the attack anthrax. And so they went through all these samples that they had gotten by subpoena or a consensual search from these labs, and they were trying to find out which lab had the fingerprint, the unique combination of DNA morphs that matched the attack anthrax. And they claimed that their analysis, scientific analysis, showed that it all tracked back to RMR 1029, the flask that they say Bruce Ivins controlled. Well, the first problem with that is Bruce Ivins didn't control RMR 1029. He did use it, but a lot of folks at US Hammered had access to it, probably 100 folks or more. He also had sent portions of that same anthrax from RMR 1029 to Dugway Proving Ground, a big Army facility that does research on, among other things, biological weapons and anthrax, and also to Battelle in Ohio, which does a lot of work for the government, including the CIA. So other people had it. It wasn't just Ivins. So the first basically misrepresentation was Ivins controlled the murder weapon. Well, that was just a lie. I mean, it just wasn't the case. So then the question is, how good was the FBI's fingerprint DNA analysis? Well, after the FBI closed its investigation, the National Research Council came out with a report. They've been asked to do this report on the FBI's science in the anthrax investigation by the FBI director himself. But instead of waiting for that analysis of the FBI science, the FBI closed its investigation before the Research Council came out with its conclusion. Well, the FBI had, I think, a sense of what that conclusion was going to be because they had several meetings with the National Research Council before. The conclusion was the science was really not good enough to draw any conclusions about where the attack anthrax came from. In other words, the assertion that it came from what they said was Bruce Ivins' RMR 1029 flask was not scientifically valid. You couldn't draw that conclusion with any scientific certainty. So they also said some other interesting things, like the morphs that formed the fingerprint were likely found at Dugway Proving Ground. Now, why did they say that? Well, it's a pretty simple analysis. We go through it in our petition. And what people don't understand is this flask that Bruce Ivins controlled had only two ingredients or two components. It had input from Bruce Ivins produced anthrax at Fort Detrick. That was from what we call RMR 1030, and it had another input. Most of it, 85%, came from Dugway. A lot of people don't realize that the murder weapon that the FBI describes as the murder weapon, 85% of it came from Dugway. Now, here's the other thing that you have to look through the footnotes in the NRC report to figure this out. The FBI didn't tell you, and that is that Bruce Ivins' RMR 1030 supply of anthrax did not have the fingerprint morphs. So think about this. You got the murder weapon that the FBI says is the murder weapon, has the fingerprint morphs. It has only two components, one of which, Bruce Ivins, doesn't have the fingerprint. What was the other component? Dugway. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that there are only two components. One doesn't have the fingerprint, the other one does. That's where the attack anthrax came from. Or now we're not saying Dugway committed the attacks. What we're saying is whoever did the attacks, it appears, got their anthrax from Dugway. May have gotten it from someone else who had the same anthrax that Dugway had. That would include Battelle, and there were probably others. So now there's another big picture point, evidence-wise, that a lot of folks don't understand about this, and that is the scientists at Fort Detrick were very much supportive of Bruce Ivins in terms of his innocence, and they were, of course, also defending themselves as against the FBI's claim that the anthrax came from Fort Detrick. So they started their own internal investigations, and they started putting the pieces together. And Colonel Arthur Anderson, Dr. Arthur Anderson, who David, got in touch with and has talked with extensively, and we talked with him a little bit, and he gave us a number of documents you'll find in our exhibits. He was in a key position at Fort Detrick. And Colonel Anderson basically disclosed to us that he attempted to report to the commander his findings that he thought would essentially exonerate Dr. Ivins and point in the direction of the real culprits. And he was told by a high level, either the commander or someone close to the commander, don't do that because a few days ago, we had a high-level visit from the Secretary of Army, and someone in the delegation, maybe the Chief of Staff, maybe the Secretary, said, essentially, we don't want to hear your concerns about the FBI's investigation because the commander himself raised it with the Secretary of the Army. And he was told, don't, basically, he said, squelch the investigations, internal investigations you're doing, and squelch the criticism of the FBI. So you got, on the one hand, an Army basically cover-up of their own, squelching their own scientists who could blow the whistle on this. And the other big picture thing is, and I'll stop on this and turn it back to Dave and you, but the other big picture point is that the FBI itself did, how can I put this tactfully, engage in its own cover-up. And the way they did that, and it's technical, but it's pretty straightforward. We know from the NRC report after the fact that Dugway was the more likely source of the fingerprint morphs. So the question is, why didn't the FBI report to the public and the Congress that Dugway's anthrax had the fingerprint? And I sort of dived into the details of the Army's records, and we found a report where the Army had provided samples from Dugway to the FBI during a search, but all those samples were dead. They were not viewable. Now, does that matter when you're doing DNA testing? Not necessarily, no. You could do DNA testing on dead material. The NRC says as much. And they said that material should have been tested, that there shouldn't have been a decision not to test. But what we found out was, and the NRC reports this, the FBI, for reasons which are not clear, established a policy which said we're not going to do DNA testing on any sample that's not viewable, on any sample that's dead. Well, what's the consequence of that? Dugway samples didn't get tested. So that was not accidental. They had to know what they were doing and that they were excluding Dugway samples. They knew what I just told you, that Ivan's flask had Dugway material in it, 85%. So we detail this in the petition, but basically we have an Army cover-up and an FBI cover-up and an innocent man being scapegoated. And in the meantime, the real attackers are still at large.
And another fingerprint, James, a real fingerprint. It wasn't the morphs. It was the B subtilis was one of the fingerprints. And when they didn't test Dugway, when they gave them a free ride, it was B subtilis that, through our investigation, we find them continually having problems with that when they run these production runs. In fact, when Bruce Ivins received the number of production runs, I think there was 13 of them that he received that comprised this flask from Dugway, which consisted of 85% of that. At least 5 of them were bad runs. They had to kill the run because of the B subtilis contamination. So by not having any kind of evaluation of Dugway's material, that not only did they skip looking for the morphs, but they skipped looking for the B subtilis. Now, B subtilis was in the anthrax letters in New York City. It wasn't found in the anthrax in Washington, D.C. with the senators. But what was found there was this microencapsulation, this aerolization. And otherwise, when you open that letter up, it's like a gas. It's not a gas, but it's like a gas. The electric charges have been altered so that it doesn't clump together. And it's just primed to inhale into your system. There's a sophisticated process where this silicon is brought into the exposorium, which is inside the spore, and it's delicate and it's sophisticated. And then there's tin. The FBI never talks about the contamination of tin. Then there's iron. They don't talk about that. Or oxygen is found out, and they really warp the silicon. They try to make it. They try to refer back to it like it was like 10 years before that silicon could be found in it. And the amounts, the quantities of silicon were not from a natural source. They were arguing a natural source. Lawrence Livermore did examinations and studies, and they showed that this was a lot of silicon there. It wasn't ever explained. So that's really important too. So they would be really the fingerprints that we could argue that's where they should have started. Even the National Academy of Sciences, it says through parallel evolution, that these morphs could have developed on their own through some kind of process they call parallel evolution. So it might not have been when Nick referred to what the standards there. They said that the connection with the Morse and the anthrax letters and the attacks were consistent. Now, the consistent is the lowest level. That means it could be non-consistent. There's other areas which could be like suggestive or indicative or demonstrative, but none of them. The highest level they couldn't go to. They could never take this evidence into court and get anywhere with it.
I think it's at this point that I'll underline the importance of that document that you're referring to, the National Academy of Science National Research Council's review of the scientific approaches used during the FBI's investigation of the 2001 anthrax letters that was published in 2011. It's a 233-page document that does provide some fairly damning evidence of the FBI's investigation, and that I did cover at the time, but has not exactly been memory holed, but at least has been largely forgotten or is excluded from the conversation about anthrax far too often. So I will underline that and provide a specific link into that document so people can review it for themselves. But let's address, I think, one of the underlying points of this conversation that I think is important to address and put on the table, which is that you mentioned the scrapping of the U.S. Biological Weapons Research Program in 1969 under Nixon as sort of a preparatory stage towards the 1972 Biological Weapons Convention. However, it is extremely important to note that on September 4th, 2001, 1 week before 9/11, 2 weeks before the anthrax attacks began, Judith Miller, yes, that Judith Miller of the New York Times, did have a front-page New York Times story, U.S. Germ Warfare Research Pushes Treaty Limits, revealing, for the first time, at least in the pages of the New York Times, that over the past several years, the United States has embarked on a program of secret research on biological weapons that, some officials say, tests the limits of the global treaty banning such weapons. And that, as she goes on to report, that research did include anthrax. So let's address the U.S. government's capabilities.
That's right.
in
during that period of time, there was 3 CIA programs that Battelle. Okay, now Battelle also, they didn't mention it to the Congress, but Battelle had the 4 morphs. There's only was 8 of 1,070 samples, 8 turned out with the 4 morphs. 7 of them were connected to Yosemite, and 1 was Battelle. Now, but during that period of Battelle, remember that they're the experts in aerolization and things of that nature. And remember that Perry Mikesell, one of the alleged suspects, he dies from over drinking, but he's working at Battelle at the time, and he's upset by some of the experiments that they're doing. But what they have is 3 programs. I think one was called Clearview or Clear Vision, one was called Bacchus, and one was called Jefferson. And these are all top secret programs, and that's what they were mentioning. Now, supposedly this was in reaction to the Russians who were supposedly doing things too with smallpox. And at Sverdlovsk, I think there was an anthrax leak, and a lot of people died there. Eventually it became out that showed that there was not a natural anthrax, but there was a bioweapon anthrax. So that maybe explains why they were doing that. Now, the definition of a bioweapon was that it has to be offensive. That's when it's illegal, if you're going to use it to attack and not necessarily defense. I mean, it gets into a gray line, because if you want to develop a vaccine, you have to have something to work with, and you need something that's virulent so that you can, and then you try to figure out what the other side has that's so virulent and create monsters. So what's happened as a result of that, all these little labs have started up all across the country, and you have got a lot of little Frankensteins. Originally, the Nixon's thinking was you don't want to give the third world countries their own nuclear bomb. You give them this anthrax or these bioweapons, and they don't have to have a lot of money. They should have to know how to grow it, and then they can, administer it. So that's where we've come now full circle, where we have more advancement. And we've seen this with the genome splicing and the DNA analysis, etc. We've become very sophisticated. The science has basically outrun the need to haul it in and start legislating properly and start enforcing and start examining what exactly is going on here, because there's all types of experiments with life, altering life that are happening, and they can all be applied, or a lot of them could be applied as weapons against people.
So, James, if I could add something to your question about the disclosure by the New York Times just a week before 9/11 of this secret bioweapons research in the U.S., it is a remarkable coincidence, if it is a coincidence, in terms of timing. But, what Dave says is a critical point. And the idea that, it can be a sort of a gray line, a fine line between offensive versus defensive biological weapons research. I mean, it's true that it can be, but let's think about the particulars here, because they may point us, and should have pointed the FBI in a direction the FBI didn't appear to be willing to go in their investigation. If you think about who's doing research for the government, defensive research, legitimate defensive research against biological warfare agents that another country might use against us, that's Fort Detrick if you're looking in terms of developing vaccines. Fort Detrick is doing that at US AMRID. But if you're not looking at developing a vaccine, but looking at some other defensive method, like how do you deal with a biological weapon that's made very dispersible through the air, that's Dugway. Dugway does that type of research. That's not US AMRID. Now, what Dave was pointing out about the nature of the attack anthrax that went to the two senators and appeared to be designed to assassinate those two senators. People don't realize this was a biological warfare attack on Congress, basically. It didn't succeed, thankfully, but it was intended to kill two United States senators. Now, that particular anthrax, as Dave said, is much more refined. It was refined not to make it necessarily a different type of toxin, but to make it more dispersible. Now, who would likely have access to that type of anthrax that's made more refined to make it more dispersible? If you're doing defensive work in the U.S., and the FBI has basically concluded this anthrax came from a U.S. facility, pretty much. They acknowledged it as the Ames strain, which is a U.S. military strain. So, they never worked with dry aerosolized anthrax at Fort Detrick, but they did at Dugway. They apparently did at Battelle, possibly in some of the research that the New York Times is talking about. So if someone were to acquire anthrax already processed in the way that ended up being used in the attack letters against the two U.S. senators, they would have had to have acquired it from a U.S. military facility doing defensive work, not in developing a vaccine, which you can do with wet anthrax. They'd have to be getting it from somewhere that dealt with defensive work related to highly dispersible powdered anthrax. And that points towards Dugway and Battelle, not towards Fort Detrick.
It's such an important point, and as you say, a point that was excluded from the FBI's investigation. Do we have anything on the record to indicate that the FBI even considered this possibility in their
Yes, we do. I have something I put aside. I've used it before, and I just want to read this to you because it was introduced to us by Barry Kissin. He's an attorney from Frederick, Maryland, and Barry is he's an advisor to the Lawyers Committee. And one of the things that Barry first told us was about this excerpt, what I'm going to read to you. And it has to do, I'm not going to read the whole thing, has to do with Congressman Nadler, because Nadler is saying, please include in your answer, because this is to Mueller, why laboratories that are publicly identified as having the equipment and personnel to make anthrax powder, such as U.S. Army's Dugway Proving Grounds in Dugway, Utah, and Battelle Memorial Institute in Jefferson, Ohio, were excluded as possible sources. And this is the answer. Again, I'm not reading the whole answer, but towards the end, here's what the FBI says, and listen to this closely. Using various methods, the FBI investigated to two facilities that received samples from the parent flask and eliminated individuals from those facilities as suspects because even if a laboratory facility had the equipment and personnel to make anthrax powder, this powder would not match the spores in the mailed envelopes if that lab had never received a transfer of anthrax from the parent flask. Now, it's a convoluted thinking. He admits that they had it, and then he says that we eliminated them because they didn't have it, even though they had it. And as Mick pointed out, 85% of what Bruce Ivins got in that flask was from Dugway. And the 15% he put in from RMR 130 was his stuff. There was no morphs in that. So all the morphs would have had to come from Dugway, and the beep is, remember, in that flask there was no B subtilis at that time. There was no silicon, there was no iron, there was no oxygen, there was no tin. Where did that all come from? It wasn't in the flask. The morphs were in the flask. But we say, forget the morphs. Let's go beyond the morphs. Let's go to that stuff, like what Mick said. This is aerolization, microencapsulation, very sophisticated. Who could do this? Fort Detrick could not do this. The scientists that we talked to, we have 4 declarations from scientists that worked there that knew Bruce Ivins. They swear that he couldn't have been this suspect. One is they knew him personally. He wasn't that type of guy, but he didn't have the knowledge and they didn't have the equipment at Fort Detrick to do it. Patty Worsham, another scientist that testifies at the grand juries, she says the same thing. So just take the investigation to the next step. Let's open it up. Put all the cards on the table.
Well, from my layman's perspective, let me just observe from an outside perspective, I don't understand how anyone can look at this research and evidence that you've compiled here and say that the FBI investigation was complete and comes to a final verdict on what actually happened here. It's so full of holes, self-evidently so, as you've pointed out here, and we have only begun to scrape the surface of the level of detail of evidence that you've provided. So I will once again really exhort people to go and look through this entire petition. But I do want to get into the specifics of what this petition is. I understand it's a petition to Congress for a redress of grievances related to government misconduct. Tell us a little bit about how this type of petition works in the legal sense.
Well, let me start with that, Dave, and you can chime in. What we're asking the Congress to do is to establish an independent commission to do its own investigation of the anthrax attacks, because as we detail in the petition, as we've touched on here, the FBI didn't tell the Congress the truth. It's not just like the FBI did an incompetent job, which would be bad enough when you're talking about a biowarfare attack on Congress. You'd want to get it right. But they actually misled not just the public, they misled the Congress. Dave gave a prime example. This report back to Nadler and the committee on, why did you exclude Battelle and Dugway as a source of the anthrax? It's not just that the FBI said something that was nonsensical, which Dave quoted, and it was nonsensical. And they're telling this to Congress. Like, here's why we eliminated Battelle and Dugway on a biowarfare attack on Congress itself. And it makes no sense. But it's worse than that. It's what they didn't say, in addition to what they did say. That's the problem. So what they should have said is what Dave told you tonight is, well, if you look at the attack anthrax, you see all this B subtilis and the attack anthrax that went to the New York Post and the New York media. And then if you look at the DC attack anthrax, you see the silicon and the microencapsulation. Well, those 2 lines of evidence, and Dave properly calls them, the real fingerprints, point to Dugway and Battelle. So when the Congress was saying, how did you eliminate Dugway and Battelle, and Mueller assigns his name to a nonsensical answer back to them, that's important, but it's also important what he didn't say. He didn't say, well, there is a line of evidence that points to Battelle and Dugway, which is the silicone microencapsulation and also the B subtilis. That was simply not disclosed to Congress, and they wanted to know. So what this petition is about is getting Congress to get the answers they wanted, but they're not going to get them from the FBI. The FBI had their chance. They didn't just screw it up. They misrepresented the material facts to Congress, literally and by omission. And so now you can't ask the FBI to investigate itself, and the FBI does need to be investigated on this. So that's why the petition is asking for Congress to appoint an independent commission and also to do its own congressional investigation of this. I'll stop there and see what Dave wants to add to that.
No, that's well said, Mick. Basically, the conflict is within the Justice Department with the FBI. Who's to investigate their investigation? Who's to investigate them? And that's where Congress has to get involved. This agency should be serving the people of the country, and it's not in that regard. At least the higher ups aren't.
It makes sense because regardless of what one thinks about the corruption of Congress, at the very least, this was literally an attack on Congress, literally addressed to two senators who also happened to be two of the senators who were expressing, if not concern or skepticism, at least putting brakes on the passage of the USA Patriot Act. Literally an attack on Congress. You would think Congress would be interested in knowing that the investigation of that attack was deliberately covered up. And I think this is all quite materially relevant to the opening of a new congressional investigation, if
Right.
out of self-interest, if nothing else.
As Mick said, too, as Mick mentioned before, too, this was really the beginning of the war on terror. They had the 9/11, it was like a 1-2 punch. And then you had the anthrax. Then you had the attacks on Afghanistan. And then you had the drumming up of the Patriot Act. Then you had the drumming up to attacks on Iraq for weapons of mass destruction that never existed. You killed 1 million people for weapons of mass destruction that never existed. What can you say about that, right?
Yes, well, hopefully the Congress can respond by at least addressing this petition. And I understand this is preparatory towards the petition to U.S. Attorney General for a grand jury investigation?
That is true. We have a follow-up petition that we're planning in a month or so, as Dave said, to a federal grand jury. It would be the same type of mechanism we used in New York on the demolition evidence to a grand jury there. To remind people, and folks may not realize this still, the federal law allows citizens to report a federal crime to a U.S. attorney and mandates the U.S. attorney to relay that evidence and report of a federal crime to a special grand jury. So it's not like the U.S. attorney can look at it and say, "Oh, I'm not interested in doing this for whatever reason, scientific, political, or otherwise." The U.S. attorney has to relay it to the grand jury. And so we're planning to do this with the anthrax attack evidence as well. And we hope we have a better initial response than we did in New York on the demolition evidence, and that we don't have to sue a second time to force the U.S. attorney and maybe a different U.S. attorney, we'll see, to do their job. But that is the plan. They may want to elaborate on that.
No, that's right. Again, we're going to be asking for a special counsel there when we go before the U.S. attorney, because it's a similar situation. And this petition will be a little broader, and it will go into the various crimes that have been committed. We'll outline the crimes, including treason that Mick may want to talk about, but certainly these bioweapons crimes and murder, right? It has no statute of limitation.
Well, treason is worth noting. Should I mention that now, James? Or?
Yes, quite quickly.
So it's a federal crime, of course, in a federal statute to commit treason. It's also a crime in the Constitution. I think it may be the only crime specified in the Constitution. And because we had an attack that was domestic from within the United States using biological weapons against the government of the United States Congress, and for a political purpose, you're basically talking about treason. I mean, that's the short version.
Again, the implications of this are incredibly vast, and they go so far to the heart of the mechanisms that have been governing not just the United States, but really internationally, this entire war on terror paradigm that's been created, that I think the ramifications of this type of investigation cannot be overstated. So I think it is extremely important that this line of inquiry be pursued, as well, of course, as the 9/11 petition that you've put out and the various mechanisms that you've put in place regarding 9/11. And as we said at the beginning of this conversation, we're going to update people about the status of your various 9/11 work. Mick or David, would you like to talk about that?
You want to start, Dave? Or?
Yeah, I'll start, and Mick will certainly finish up. Back in, I think it was November 8th or November 9th of 2018, we received a letter from the U.S. Attorney Berman, who said that he received and reviewed our material and that he would comply with the law, which was 18 USC 3332A. And that had to do with him making a presentation to the grand jury. So we were fairly excited about that. Nothing happened forever. We had contacted, Mick and I had talked to the office there, and they couldn't tell us anything. Eventually, we had to sue. Now, what happened is they come back, the U.S. attorney, and say we don't have standing. Now, we do have standing, or at least we argue we have standing. Architects and engineers is one of the plaintiffs, along with Richard Gage. Then we have Commissioner Joya, who is a fire commissioner. He's from Nassau County in New York. He worked on the piles. He has friends that were killed. We have the one co-plaintiff who lost her husband, was a valiant firefighter. We have another co-plaintiff who lost her brother. He's a valiant firefighter. We have Robert
McIlvaine.
Robert McIlvaine, who lost his son, Bobby McIlvaine. And then we have Chief O'Kelly, who was a hazmat fire chief in New York City, who has a permanent disability because of it. So we think that we have standing. Now we're arguing that, and Mick can take it further because he's working directly on the petition in the brief.
Well, we did oppose the government's motion to dismiss. This is the New York case on the demolition evidence of the towers, which we did the grand jury petition on, and trying to force the U.S. attorney to give the petition to the grand jury. And we have really, I don't know if this has ever been done before. I don't think I've seen a case exactly like this, because the government is trying to say we don't have standing to litigate this, even all the great plaintiffs that David mentioned who have suffered, so terribly from the attacks, and the government saying none of these folks have a right to sue to get this evidence put before a grand jury, which I just find personally offensive. But putting that aside, what we're really doing here is saying we're exercising a right under the First Amendment of the Constitution to petition the government regarding the need to look at this evidence. Now, the U.S. attorney is treating this as if we're petitioning the U.S. attorney. Well, we did petition the U.S. attorney, but that's not the only government entity we're petitioning. We're also petitioning the grand jury itself, which is a government entity. We have a right to petition the grand jury under the First Amendment. Now, so the government's trying to say we don't even have standing to complain that the U.S. attorney is roadblocking the delivery of our petition to a government entity which we have a right to petition, which is the grand jury. It's one thing to say if the U.S. attorney doesn't want to look at our petition itself, but can it really, what authority does it have to prevent the delivery of our petition to another government entity? Now, we're forced by federal statute to go through the U.S. attorney to have documents delivered to the grand jury. That's a federal statute. But they can't change the constitutional right to petition the grand jury. So can we not have standing to complain that one federal agency is obstructing the delivery of a First Amendment petition to another federal agency? I don't understand that. It makes no sense to me.
Yeah, and when you think of it, like Mick said, right, like we said, these people suffered terrible injury. Bob McIlvaine lost his son. One lady lost her husband. One lady lost her brother. The others have disabilities from it. How can you say you don't have standing? It's incredible.
It's not only incredible, I think it speaks to the gravity of the situation that we find ourselves in and the importance of the work that you're doing in raising these issues. If nothing else, then in raising these issues, bringing it to the public's attention, compiling this evidence, making it publicly available, and taking the legal steps to try to bring some sort of justice to these issues. It is commendable work, and I will once again refer people to that work at lc4911.org. That's lcfor911.org. And of course, as I say, all of the resources that we talk about today are going to be linked in the show notes for this conversation, so people can examine them for themselves. But finally today, if people want to support the work that you are doing, how can they best do so?
Well, let's thank you for allowing us to be here, James. How they can best support us is to go on our website, lc4for911.org, and you can help us through donations. In order to do the level that we're doing, we want to take it up higher. We have other grand jury petitions to do besides this. As you know, there was myriad crimes committed in 9/11. We're looking at a government obstruction and misconduct grand jury, which will link everything together. And we have some really interesting people, highly qualified people would like to get involved in that petition. We didn't even touch Shanksville yet. We didn't touch the Pentagon yet. We'd like to do that. We have plans for a campaign, for a FOIA campaign, of maybe 100 FOIAs, Freedom of Information Acts. We'll create a large library we would share with the public, but we need more manpower and we need money. as all that. We're nonprofit, so it's tax deductible. And if you think that what we're doing is good, and you're listening to this broadcast, please help us. We need your financing. It will go for a good purpose, and we'll do the best we can to try and connect these crimes, take them into the court, sue who we have to, and get some kind of finally closure on this terrible situation and a terrible crime that was committed against the people of the United States.
Mick, anything to add on that note before we go?
Well, that captures it pretty well. I would just add that in addition to, sort of desperately needing some financial support, folks don't understand how much we're volunteering and how much we're donating of our own money. Dave and I are paid part-time for a couple of years. We worked without being paid before, and we'll probably work without being paid in the future. But we really need more attorneys on board. So, with all those civil litigation attorneys out there, public interest attorneys listening, please volunteer some time. We could use your help on this team. In addition, we need more young people to get involved. I think for some reason, maybe because it happened 20 years ago, younger people are thinking it's not their issue. But, this continuing war on terror is affecting their future. And, we're not talking yet about coronavirus, but we are talking about a biological weapon. And the perpetrators who committed the biological weapon attack haven't been brought to justice. They're still out there. They're free to commit another one whenever it suits their purpose. And it could also suit their purpose, even if something like the coronavirus isn't a biological weapon. It might also suit their purpose to take advantage of a biological outbreak. And, the folks who committed these attacks have some sophistication. So this isn't over. And it's not an issue in the past. This is very much an issue for the new generation.
It certainly is. I couldn't stress that enough. And if people need more elaboration on that point, I will just direct them to my own episode 383 of my podcast on COVID-9/11, from Homeland Security to Biosecurity, and my recent work on the dawn of false flag bioterrorism that I think are highly relevant to this discussion and do connect some of the dots institutionally and legislatively between the anthrax attacks and what's happening now. I know that's beyond the purview of what you're addressing in these petitions, but I think it's important context for what's happening right now. I think we're going to have to leave the conversation there for today. Obviously, I am looking forward to updates on this as your petitions progress. So thank you very much for your time, gentlemen.
Thank you, James.
Thanks a lot.
Take care.